You may turn around. Running would be inadvisable.
There is nowhere to go.
Sebastian, you know I did not do this.
I cannot prove what I know.
I will collect my things.
Clara.
I will not ask you to defend me against evidence I cannot counter and accusations I cannot—
You rode here yourself?
Yes.
In November?
The weather was acceptable when I left. I should have told you in that room that I knew it was fabricated.
The door should not have opened. That was the first thing Clara Ashby thought when the heavy oak swung inward beneath her hand, silently, without resistance, as though it had been waiting for her. She had tried 6 doors in the last 10 minutes, each one locked, each one another reminder that Greystone Palace had been designed by someone who believed in keeping certain people out of certain places. She had assumed this one would be the same. She was wrong. The room beyond was enormous and dark, lit only by a fire burning low in a stone hearth that could have swallowed her entire bedroom at home. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling on 3 walls. A desk sat near the window, covered in papers weighted by a single candle burning down to its last inch. The rain outside struck the glass in steady, rhythmic sheets, and the wind moved through the palace corridors with a low, mournful sound that Clara had not yet grown accustomed to in her 3 weeks of service here. She stepped back immediately. The housekeeper's quarters were clearly not here. Nothing about this room suggested anything so practical as a housekeeper. Everything about it suggested power, restrained, deliberate, and very much occupied. She reached for the door handle to pull it shut. The lock clicked, not from her hand, from somewhere else entirely. Clara froze. "You may turn around," said a voice behind her. "Running would be inadvisable. There is nowhere to go." She turned. He was standing at the window with his back to her, a glass of whiskey held loosely at his side, the amber catching what little firelight reached him. He wore no coat. His shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled to the forearm. His shoulders were broad and very still, the kind of stillness that did not suggest relaxation. It suggested complete control. When he turned, the firelight found his face, and Clara understood for the first time why the staff spoke his name in lower voices than they used for everything else. Sebastian Wyndham, Duke of Greystone. She had seen him at a distance. Once in the entrance hall when she first arrived, once crossing the garden from the upper window of the east corridor. Both times he had looked like a portrait of himself, perfectly composed, perfectly unreachable. The kind of man who existed in a category so far removed from her own that she had never once thought to form an opinion about him beyond the purely observational. Up close, he was something else entirely. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of winter sky or morning mist, the hard, particular gray of iron that has been tested and held. They moved over her face with an efficiency that felt almost clinical, assessing, cataloging, arriving at conclusions she could not read. "Miss Ashby," he said. Her name in his mouth was startling. She had not given it to him. "Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was looking for Mrs. Calloway's quarters. I took a wrong turning in the east corridor and the storm made it. I had no intention of— I know you had no intention," he said. He set down the whiskey glass on the desk beside him and moved toward her. Not quickly. Every step was measured, deliberate, the way a man moves when he has never once needed to hurry, because the world has always waited for him. "That is not why I locked the door." Clara's gaze moved past him to the desk. She could not help it. The letter was there, partially unfolded, its contents visible from where she stood. Not the full text, but enough. A royal seal at the top. A name she recognized from the newspapers. 3 lines of print that her quick, well-trained eye had absorbed in the half-second she had been looking at the room, before she realized it was occupied. She looked back at him. He had seen her look. "Ah," he said softly. "There it is. I did not read it," she said. "Your eyes are too intelligent for that to be entirely true." Clara pressed her lips together. She would not beg. She would not flatter him. She would not perform the particular brand of frightened deference that men in this world often expected from women in her position. She had learned a long time ago that performing fear only made things worse, because it confirmed to powerful people that they had found the correct point of pressure. "If you are concerned that I will repeat what I may or may not have glimpsed on a letter I was not meant to see," she said carefully, "then I give you my word that I will not. I have no interest in palace politics, and no one who would benefit from anything I might tell them. You have my assurance, and I will say good night." She reached for the door handle again. "Sit down, Miss Ashby. Your Grace, not a request." He said it without heat, without threat. Simply a fact, the way one might state that the fire was burning or the rain was falling. "Sit down. I will have tea sent up. We will resolve this by morning, and then you may go wherever you like." Clara looked at the locked door. Then at him. Then at the armchair by the fire, positioned as though it had been placed there specifically for someone who needed to think through a problem in the middle of the night. She crossed the room and sat. Sebastian watched her do it, not with satisfaction, not with arrogance, but with something that looked, in the unguarded flicker of a second, almost like relief, as though he had been alone in this room with something unbearable, and her presence, even adversarial and confined, was marginally better than the alternative. He moved to pull a cord near the fireplace to signal for tea, then returned to the window and stood looking out at the rain. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You knew my name," Clara said finally. "Before tonight." "Yes. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The rain filled the silence. "Because it is my palace," he said, "and I make it my business to know every person in it." It was not an answer. They both knew it was not an answer. But the hour was late, and the fire was warm, and the rain showed no sign of stopping, and Clara understood, in the particular instinctive way she understood most things, that the truth of why Sebastian Wyndham knew her name would not be given to her tonight. Perhaps not for some time. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the fire and waited, because waiting was something she had learned to do very well, and because somewhere beneath the fear and the irritation and the absurdity of sitting locked in the Duke of Greystone's private chamber, in the middle of a November storm, something else had taken up quiet residence in her chest, something she did not have a name for yet, something that felt, inexplicably, like the beginning of everything. The tea arrived. The storm did not pass. And neither of them mentioned, not once in the hours that followed, that the key remained in his coat pocket the entire time, and that he had never once moved to use it. The tea grew cold before either of them touched it. Clara had not intended to fall asleep. She had told herself, with considerable conviction, that she would remain alert, that she would watch the man across the room with appropriate wariness and wait for the moment he decided she had been sufficiently detained and unlocked the door. She had intended to be dignified and composed, and entirely in possession of herself for the duration of whatever this was. She was asleep within the hour, curled sideways in the wing-back chair with her cheek against her hand, and her dark hair falling loose from its pins, her breath quiet, and even against the backdrop of fading rain. Sebastian did not sleep. He stood at the window for a long time, then moved to the desk, then back to the window again. He poured a second glass of whiskey and did not drink it. He looked at the letter twice more and then turned it face down with a deliberateness that suggested he had made some decision about it, or was trying to. At some point, very early in the gray hours before dawn, he pulled a second chair to the far side of the room and sat facing her. Not watching her the way a man watches something he considers a threat, watching her the way a man watches something that has surprised him, trying to understand the nature of the surprise, turning it over carefully, learning its shape. She was not what he had expected. He had known her name for 2 weeks. His steward had mentioned a new lady's companion taken on at the recommendation of the late Lord Ashby's former solicitor. An appointment made by Lady Harwick, his cousin, who managed the domestic staff with the efficiency of someone who viewed human beings primarily as instruments of social utility. The recommendation had noted that the girl was educated, capable, and in reduced circumstances. Reduced circumstances being, Sebastian had long since learned, a phrase the aristocracy used when it meant ruined. He had noted the name, he had not thought much beyond it. And then, 3 days after her arrival, he had been passing through the upper gallery and heard her reading aloud to Lady Harwick from a French philosophical text. Not translating. Reading, with comprehension, with inflection, with the quiet confidence of someone for whom the words held actual meaning rather than social ornament. He had stopped walking. He had stood outside the gallery door for 4 minutes, which was the longest he had stood still for any reason in recent memory, listening to Clara Ashby read Montaigne, with the kind of ease most women in his world reserved for reading dress invoices. He had walked away without entering. He had thought about it more than was appropriate for the following 2 weeks. Now she was asleep in his chair in the middle of the night, having walked into his private chamber entirely by accident, and looked at a letter she was not meant to see and delivered a speech about her war. integrity with the composure of a woman who had been holding herself together through considerably worse than this for a very long time. When dawn finally arrived, pale and tentative behind the rain-washed windows, Sebastian rose and unlocked the door. He did it quietly, without waking her. He stood for a moment looking at the key in his hand, then set it on the desk where she would see it when she woke. He was at the window again, dressed and composed by the time she stirred. Clara opened her eyes and for 3 seconds looked completely disoriented. Then awareness returned. He watched it move across her face, the recollection of where she was and why, followed immediately by the particular expression of someone who has done the social calculation and found the sum embarrassing. She sat up and straightened her hair with quick, practiced hands. "Good morning," Sebastian said. "Good morning, Your Grace." She looked at the key on the desk, then at him. "You unlocked it. Sommetai mago." A pause. "You could have woken me. You needed sleep more than you needed dignity." It was blunt and accurate, and she visibly did not know whether to be offended or grateful. She chose a third option, which was to stand and smooth her dress and say nothing at all, which Sebastian found he respected. "You may go," he said. She crossed to the door. Reached the threshold. He said her name, not Miss Ashby. Her name, Clara. She turned. He looked at her in the early morning light. No firelight now, just the clear, unforgiving gray of a November dawn which hid nothing, and said, "I know what brought you to Greystone Palace. Your father's death, the dissolution of his practice, the creditors." He said it without cruelty, without performance, simply acknowledged. "I am telling you now to be careful. Not everyone in this palace wants you here, and the ones who don't are not the kind of people who announce their intentions." Clara held his gaze for a long, still moment. "Are you warning me?" she asked. "Yes. Why?" He didn't answer. He looked at her with those iron-gray eyes that gave away nothing, except the fact that something was being held back, and said, "Go and get some sleep, in a proper bed this time." She left, and she walked the entire length of the east corridor and down 2 flights of stairs and all the way to her small room at the back of the servants' wing, before she allowed herself to stop and lean against the wall and press both hands over her heart and acknowledge that something was happening to her that she had not anticipated and did not know how to stop. She had lost her father 18 months ago, quietly, in the way that decent men often died. Insufficient funds for sufficient doctors, a dignified silence about the severity of things, a letter from a solicitor 6 weeks after the funeral explaining the full extent of what remained, which was, to be precise, almost nothing. She had sold what she could sell. She had declined 2 offers of marriage from men who were kind enough, but wanted a housekeeper more than a wife. She had taken work, first as a governess, then as a reader for an elderly countess, then, through a chain of necessary compromises, as a lady's companion at Greystone Palace. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity was a luxury she had decided very early. She could not afford, and she had never been particularly tempted by it anyway. But she was tired, in a way that sleep did not entirely fix. The accumulated weight of performing composure and capability every single day without anyone asking whether she was all right. Sebastian Wyndham had not asked whether she was all right, but he had seen the turned gloves, the careful ribbon on the old dress, the paste pearls. He had looked at all of it and said nothing except be careful in a tone that suggested he had been watching for longer than last night. Clara stood in the corridor outside her room and thought about that. Then she opened the door, changed out of her crumpled dress, and reported to Lady Harwick's sitting room at precisely the correct time, looking as though she had slept 8 full, uninterrupted hours. She was very good at appearances. She had learned from the best, from a world that required them absolutely, and offered almost nothing real in return. Almost. 3 floors above, Sebastian Wyndham turned the unsigned letter face up again and read the final line one more time. He already knew what it said. He had known for a week, but reading it again felt like pressing on a bruise, painful, purposeful, and impossible to stop. The name at the bottom of the letter was not a signature. It was a threat, and it involved a woman whose name he had only learned to say aloud 2 weeks ago, which was already 2 weeks, too long for him to pretend it did not matter. Lady Harwick smiled the way expensive knives were sharp, beautifully, and with obvious purpose. She was Sebastian's cousin on his father's side, 41 years old, possessed of excellent cheekbones and a social intelligence that she deployed with the precision of someone who had spent decades learning exactly which pressure points made people comply. She had managed the domestic affairs of Greystone Palace for 3 years, ever since Sebastian's last housekeeper retired, and she performed the role with an efficiency that was, on the surface, entirely admirable. On the surface, Clara had learned in 3 weeks to read the surface very carefully. "You look pale this morning," Lady Harwick observed, not looking up from the correspondence she was reviewing as Clara settled into the chair across from her. "I trust you slept adequately." "Very well, thank you, my lady." "Good. I need you to transcribe these letters before noon. Lord Pemberton's secretary will collect them at 2 o'clock, and they must be in proper order." She slid the stack across the desk. "Also, Lord Ashford has arrived. He will be staying in the south wing through the end of the month." Clara picked up the letters. "Shall I prepare the usual welcome correspondence?" "I'll handle Lord Ashford's welcome personally," Lady Harwick said. Something in her tone suggested this was not purely a matter of hospitality. "He is an important man. Political connections in 3 counties, substantial landholdings, and an interest in securing alliances that benefit the Greystone estate." She looked up then, and her eyes rested on Clara with that particular quality of assessment she occasionally directed at her. Not unkind, exactly, but cataloguing. Always cataloguing. "I trust you will conduct yourself appropriately in his presence." "Of course, my lady." Lord Ashford arrived at 11:30. Clara encountered him in the corridor outside the library, where she had gone to return the reference volume Lady Harwick required for the Pemberton correspondence. He was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 35, with the easy, practiced handsomeness of a man who had been told all his life that his face was an asset and had learned to deploy it accordingly. He wore his coat with studied carelessness. His smile arrived with the speed of something that had been calibrated for maximum effect. "You must be the new companion," he said, as though discovering something pleasant. "Miss Ashby," Clara said. "Clara Ashby. Good morning, my lord. Lord Ashford." He offered a slight bow that was more charming than it was respectful. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting anyone quite like you at Greystone Palace before, Miss Ashby. The staff are usually considerably less—" He paused, letting the pause do work it had no business doing. "Interesting. That is kind of you to say, my lord." Clara kept her voice pleasant and continued walking. He fell into step beside her. "Are you settled in? The palace can be overwhelming at first. All these corridors. I've been visiting for years, and I still occasionally find myself in entirely the wrong wing." "I'm finding my way," she said. "Excellent. Perhaps I might assist with the orientation. The East Gardens are particularly worth seeing in November. Stark, but rather beautiful." He smiled again. "I could show you tomorrow morning if you're free." Clara looked at him. He was charming. Genuinely charming. The kind that was easy to respond to if one did not look too carefully at what lived behind it. She did look carefully. She generally did. "That's very kind," she said, "but I have duties that keep me occupied most mornings. Please excuse me, my lord." She turned the corner and walked away at a pace that was unhurried enough to be polite and purposeful enough to be unmistakable. Behind her, Lord Ashford watched her go with the expression of a man who found obstacles more interesting than easy victories. What Clara did not see, because she had already turned the corner, was Sebastian Wyndham standing at the far end of that same corridor, completely motionless, having arrived from the upper staircase at precisely the wrong moment, or perhaps precisely the right one. He had watched the entire exchange from a distance of 40 feet. He stood there for a moment after she disappeared, looking at the space where she had been. Then he looked at Ashford, who was now straightening his cuffs with the satisfied air of a man who had found his entertainment for the month. Sebastian's jaw tightened, once, briefly, before his face returned to its default expression of impenetrable composure. He turned and walked in the opposite direction without a word. That evening, Clara was reading aloud to Lady Harwick in the gold sitting room when the door opened and Sebastian entered. He acknowledged his cousin with a brief nod and then— and this was the part that made Clara lose her place in the text and have to find it again. He looked directly at her. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I've spoken with the household steward. Your duties are being expanded effective immediately. You will assist me with correspondence and household records in addition to your current role." He said it to the room, the way one announces decisions that have already been made. "The additional workload warrants an adjusted wage." Lady Harwick's chin lifted by a fraction. "Sebastian, that is entirely unnecessary. Miss Ashby is quite occupied with... Thank you, Genevieve. His tone was pleasant and absolute. The arrangement begins tomorrow morning. Miss Ashby, I study at 9 o'clock. He left. The silence he left behind was a specific kind, the kind that had edges. Lady Harwick set down her embroidery and looked at Clara with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning. It was something in between, which Clara found significantly more alarming than either. How very interesting, Lady Harwick said softly. Clara looked back at the book in her lap and found her place and continued reading in a clear, steady voice, because that was what the situation required, and because she was extremely good at doing what situations required, regardless of what was happening in the private interior of her own chest, which was, at this particular moment, considerably louder than she would have liked. She found Sebastian in the east corridor the following afternoon, not in his study, but near the portrait gallery, where she had gone to deliver a document she had transcribed from that morning's dictation. He was standing before one of the older portraits, hands clasped behind his back, looking up at a man who shared his bone structure and almost none of his expression. The man in the portrait looked comfortable in his power in a way Sebastian never quite did, wearing it loosely, the way inherited things were worn. Sebastian carried him differently, as though he had earned it against some resistance she could not name. Your great-grandfather? She asked, because silence between them had started to feel like something she was choosing rather than something imposed on her, and choosing felt different. His brother, Sebastian said, 3rd Duke of Greystone. He died at 31, unmarried, no heir, considerable debt. His younger brother inherited everything. He was quiet for a moment. People in this family have a history of complicating what should be simple. Most people do, Clara said. He looked at her sideways. You're very calm for someone who was locked in a stranger's room 4 nights ago. I decided some time ago that sustained panic was inefficient. Did you? It was not quite a question. He turned back to the portrait. Lord Ashford spoke to you yesterday. She noticed he did not ask it as a question either. Briefly, she said. In the corridor outside the library. He is not here for political alliances, Sebastian said. His voice was even. Completely even. In the deliberate way of someone who has been practicing evenness. Whatever my cousin has told you about his visit, Ashford comes to Greystone when he wants something that isn't available to him in London. He has a habit of identifying, he paused, people who are in positions of vulnerability, and making himself appear to be the solution. Clara looked at the side of his face. Are you warning me again? Apparently yes. Your Grace, she said, and waited until he turned to look at her. I appreciate the warnings. Genuinely. But I have been navigating men like Lord Ashford my entire adult life without the assistance of a duke. I know what a charm designed to extract something looks like. She held his gaze. I am not naive. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite a surprise, but the near cousin of it. The thing that surprise becomes when a person has been underestimating someone for long enough that the correction finally lands. No, he said quietly. You are not. He walked away first this time. Clara stood in the portrait gallery and looked up at the 3rd Duke of Greystone's comfortable, uncomplicated face, and thought about the 4th, and the 5th, and the entirely unpredictable 6th, and tried very hard not to smile. She was mostly unsuccessful. That evening, Lord Ashford sent flowers to her room. A small arrangement, tasteful, with a card that said simply, "The garden offer remains open." Clara put them on the windowsill. Sebastian, walking the upper corridor 3 floors above, saw the light in her window and the shape of the arrangement on the sill and stopped walking for 4 full seconds before he continued. He slept badly that night. He did not examine why. Working beside Sebastian Wyndham was nothing like Clara had imagined. She had prepared herself, reasonably, for a man who dictated and expected perfect execution and offered no explanation for his reasoning. She had prepared for cold efficiency, for the particular impersonality of powerful men who viewed staff as extensions of their own will, rather than independent people with functional minds. What she had not prepared for was 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, Sebastian standing at his desk with his coat abandoned over a chair and his reading glasses, which she was fairly certain he did not know she had noticed, held in his left hand as he read through a brief from the Parliamentary Reform Committee, saying, "Tell me what you think of this argument," and actually meaning it. She stood there for a moment, holding her pen above the ledger, and said, "About the factory inspection clause? About all of it. You've read the supporting documentation. What is your assessment? Clara looked at the brief. She had read it. She had also, in the hour before 9 o'clock, read the 2 counterbriefs that Sebastian had left on the corner of the desk without asking her to, because she had assumed he had left them there for a reason, and she was constitutionally incapable of ignoring documents that clearly belonged to a larger argument. The inspection clause is the strongest part, she said. The wage minimum proposal is the weakest, not because it's wrong, but because the language is imprecise enough to be challenged in committee. The opposing counsel will find 4 different interpretable readings and use all of them. Sebastian lowered the brief and looked at her. Fix the language, he said. I'm your correspondence assistant, Your Grace. I'm not a... Fix the language, Miss Ashby. She fixed the language. He read it, made 2 small adjustments, and submitted it to his parliamentary secretary that afternoon without explanation or credit, because that was how these things worked, and they both understood it. But he had looked at what she had written with the focused attention of someone taking it seriously, rather than humoring her. And that was worth more to Clara. She found, than credit, in a document she would never have been allowed to put her name on anyway. This became their rhythm. She arrived at 9. He was always already there. They worked in a silence that was increasingly comfortable. She at the correspondence desk, he at the larger desk, occasionally asking her opinion on things that ranged from parliamentary language to estate management disputes, to, once, the appropriate response to a letter from a neighboring duke who had apparently been conducting a passive-aggressive feud over a shared water boundary for 17 years. What would you do? Sebastian asked, reading her the letter. Resolve the water boundary, Clara said without looking up. The feud is about something else entirely. The water boundary is just the available surface for it. A pause. What is it actually about? His father sold your grandfather a horse that died within the year, and neither family has ever directly acknowledged it, so it keeps finding new shapes. Sebastian looked at her. How do you know that? Mrs. Calloway mentioned it when I first arrived. She has an extraordinary memory for ancestral grievances. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I will resolve the water boundary. That seems wise, Your Grace. These moments accumulated, the way such things did, not dramatically, not in grand declarations, but in the quiet layering of days that began to feel like something she wanted to continue. She learned that Sebastian took his coffee so strongly it was nearly undrinkable by any normal standard, and that he drank it anyway, because the bitterness seemed to suit his morning temperament. She learned that he had read nearly everything in the library, and retained most of it, and that he occasionally tested the retention on her with a subtle casualness that she recognized, after the second time, as his version of showing off. She found it endearing. She refused to tell him so. She also learned, gradually and without him intending to teach her, that the stone he carried was not native to him. It had been built, stone by stone, year by year, by a father who had treated emotional expression as evidence of weakness, who had sent a 10-year-old boy to school in the north of England in November, without winter clothes because toughening was the point, who had died when Sebastian was 22 and left him a title, 3 failing estates, and a note that said, in its entirety, "Do better than I did." Sebastian had not told her any of this directly. He had told her in pieces without intending to, in the way he talked about the reform bills, always from the angle of the people affected rather than the political gain, in the way he had dismissed a steward last week for speaking to a housemaid with contempt, without ceremony or explanation beyond that, is not how people are spoken to here, in the way he had said, that afternoon in the portrait gallery, that his family had a history of complicating what should be simple, and she had heard in it not pride or irony but something older and quieter. She understood complicated inheritances. She knew what it was to carry the shape of someone who had left damage in their passing, and to spend years trying to straighten what they had bent. 3 weeks into their working arrangement, late on a Wednesday evening, when the light had gone amber and the palace had grown quiet, and they had been working for 4 hours longer than strictly necessary, because the parliamentary session was in 2 days, and the documentation was not finished. Sebastian set down his pen and said, without preamble, "The letter you saw that first night." Clara looked up. He had turned his chair toward the window, not looking at her. Outside, the gardens were dark and still, the grounds stretching away toward the tree line in shapes of deeper darkness. "The Royal Council has given me 60 days to announce an engagement," he said, "to a woman of their choosing. Genevieve's choosing, more accurately, since Genevieve has apparently been in correspondence with 3 council members for the better part of a year without my knowledge." He said it without visible anger, which somehow made it sound more serious than anger would have. If I refuse, they will surface a financial irregularity from my father's time as Duke, something that was buried because it was politically inconvenient to expose it then. They will use it now. Clara was quiet. She was very good at being quiet when someone needed to say a thing without interruption. The irregularity involves an arrangement my father made with a shipping company that no longer exists, Sebastian continued, and 3 payments that went to men who held positions in the government at the time. It looks like bribery. It was, in fact, survival. The estates were failing, and my father made a terrible choice. But looking like bribery, with my name attached to it now, would be sufficient to remove me from Parliament and destroy 20 years of work on legislation that actually matters. So they have you, Clara said quietly. Yes. He turned then and looked at her with those iron-gray eyes that were, in the low amber light, fractionally less guarded than usual. They have me. And the woman they've chosen? Lord Ashford's younger sister, 19 years old, well-connected, and entirely indifferent to me personally, which I understand is considered an advantage in these negotiations. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more like the acknowledgement of an absurdity, too dark for proper humor. Clara looked at her hands on the desk. She was aware very precisely of what she was feeling and why, and she was also aware that what she was feeling was almost entirely beside the point. She was a companion. He was a duke being politically cornered. These were 2 entirely separate categories of problem. "Why are you telling me?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you were the first person in 10 years to walk into this room without wanting something from me." It landed in the silence between them, with a weight that neither of them had quite anticipated. Sebastian looked at it the way one looked at something said aloud that had previously only existed as thought, with a kind of careful surprise, as though the words had moved faster than his intention. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. The fire settled in the hearth. The wind moved through the palace corridors. And somewhere in the building, in the south wing where he had been installed with studied inconvenience, Lord Ashford was walking back from wherever he had been, and happened to pass the library where Clara had mentioned she sometimes sat in the evenings. He knocked. She was not there, as it happened, because she was in Sebastian's study having a conversation that had shifted the entire interior landscape of her life while she was only halfway paying attention. But Ashford did not know that. He waited for a while in the corridor outside the library, and when he finally turned to leave, he passed a footman who mentioned, entirely without guile, that Miss Ashby had been in the Duke's study since after supper and had not yet come down. Ashford smiled. He filed it away. He had made his decision sometime around midnight. By the time Sebastian finally sent Clara back to her rooms with 2 hours left before dawn, he stood at his window looking out at the dark gardens, and understood, with the particular clarity that came to him only in absolute stillness, that the 60 days the council had given him were no longer just a political problem. They had become something far more personal and far more dangerous. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, carried to Sebastian's study by his steward with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he wished were not his responsibility. Sebastian read it once, then set it face down on the desk. He called for Clara. She arrived at 9 o'clock as usual, noting immediately that something was wrong from the quality of the room. Not from anything visible, but from the particular atmosphere of a space recently occupied by a decision. Sebastian was standing at the fireplace rather than the desk. His coffee was untouched. He was looking at the grate with the fixed attention of a man who was not actually seeing it. He turned when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did. He picked up the letter from the desk and crossed to her and held it out. Clara took it. "Read it." It was a single page, written in a neat, precise hand that she did not immediately recognize. It outlined, in careful and specific detail, that the confidential correspondence in Sebastian's parliamentary files had been accessed without authorization over the preceding month, and that copies had been made available to Lord Ashford's political secretary. The evidence pointed, the letter said, to a member of the household staff who had been seen entering the study outside of working hours. The letter named her. Clara read it twice. She looked at the handwriting and recognized it the second time. The particular slant, the formation of the capital letters. She had transcribed enough of Lady Harwick's correspondence to know it intimately. She folded the letter. I placed it on the desk. She looked at Sebastian. His expression was entirely closed. Not cold exactly, something more difficult than cold. The expression of a man who has been betrayed before and knows what it costs to accuse incorrectly, and is calculating very carefully whether the evidence before him is as solid as it is presented. "This is not my handwriting," Clara said. "I know." "Then it is also probably not your handwriting without comparison documents, which are currently held by the household steward under Lady Harwick's instruction." He said it flatly, as though reciting the dimensions of a problem he had already measured. "The access log for the study shows the door was opened after hours on 3 occasions in the past month. I was not present on any of those occasions. You were in the building. So was nearly everyone else in the palace." "Yes, Sebastian." She said his name, which she had only done once before, and watched it register in the slight shift of his jaw. "You know I did not do this." He looked at her. For a long moment, something fought visibly across his face. No doubt about her. She could see it was not that, but something harder and more complicated. A calculation that involved her and the letter, and the 60-day ultimatum, and Ashford and Lady Harwick, and 3 years of political positioning, all arriving at the same moment, all requiring something from him that he did not know how to give cleanly. "I cannot prove what I know," he said, "and the council has already been informed." The air left the room. Clara understood, in that moment, the full architecture of what had been done. This was not a spontaneous accusation. It was constructed, timed precisely for when it would be most effective, after she had become useful to Sebastian, after their arrangement had given her access to things that could be questioned, after Ashford had 3 weeks of observation to use. She could fight it. She had almost no resources with which to fight it, and no allies in a palace where every person with power had something to gain from her removal. She could stay and be dismantled slowly, publicly, her reputation reduced to the thing Lady Harwick intended, a fortune-seeking woman of reduced circumstances who had used a position of proximity to a powerful man for personal gain. Or she could leave with what remained, which was not very much, but it was hers. "I will collect my things," she said. "Clara, I will not ask you to defend me against evidence I cannot counter and accusations I cannot disprove in a palace where every instrument of proof is held by the person who fabricated this." She said it without trembling, without the hot pressure of tears she could feel gathering at the back of her throat. She said it with the same composure she had brought to everything, the turned gloves, the paste pearls, the accumulated years of holding herself together through the specific dignity of having no alternative. "That would put you in an impossible position, and it would not help me." "I am going to find the truth," Sebastian said. "I know you will." She looked at him with her gray eyes that gave away slightly more than she intended. Not tears, not anger, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been here before, in different rooms with different names on the accusation, and has long since learned that the truth is rarely fast enough to be useful. "But I cannot wait in this palace while you do." Sebastian did not stop her. She had known before she said it that he would not because he did not want to, but because what she had said was true, and he was a man who could not argue with truth even when it was inconvenient. He stood at the fireplace and watched her cross to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. She did not look back. "The wage minimum language in the parliamentary brief," she said quietly. "Make sure they do not revert to the original phrasing in committee. The 3rd clause specifically." Then she left. The palace carriage was made available to her. Sebastian's instruction, delivered through the steward, because there were no other carriages at short notice, and he would not have her walking to a boarding house in November. It was the only thing he could do for her in that moment, that she would accept. Clara sat in the carriage with her single bag and looked out at Greystone Palace as it diminished behind her, and pressed her hand flat against the window glass, and held herself together through the familiar, exhausting effort of refusing to break. She was deposited at a modest boarding house on Calloway Street. The room was small and clean. The landlady asked no questions, which Clara was grateful for. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall. She had been here before, in different rooms, in different versions of this particular bottom. She had gotten up before. She would get up again. What she had not had before, and what she did not examine too closely now, because examining it would make the room feel smaller, was the knowledge that somewhere in Greystone Palace, Sebastian Wyndham was at his desk with a letter in his hand, and his face closed and his jaw set, and he was doing what he did with every problem that mattered. He was working. 3 floors up in the east wing of Greystone Palace, Lady Harwick sat by the window and watched the carriage disappear down the long drive with the expression of a woman who had completed a necessary task. She was wrong about several things. She was wrong about Sebastian's reaction. She had expected relief, or at minimum, return to the existing order. What she got instead that same evening was her nephew asking to review 18 months of domestic staff appointment records, all correspondence sent from the palace in the preceding 6 weeks, and the full household access logs. He asked in the polite tone he reserved for things he had already decided. Lady Harwick understood, too late, that she had made a very significant error in judgment. She had assumed that Sebastian Wyndham's composure meant he did not care. She had forgotten that the most dangerous thing about a man who controls his emotions perfectly is that when he finally acts on them, there is nothing left to hold him back. Sebastian did not sleep. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, slept properly since the night Clara had walked into his chamber in the middle of a storm and fallen asleep in his chair and woken up in the grey dawn, looking like someone who had spent years perfecting the art of expecting nothing good and had not yet decided whether to revise that expectation. He sat at his desk through the night with the access logs spread before him and worked with the methodical intensity that had gotten him through Cambridge in record time and 3 failing estates and 17 years of parliamentary sessions that moved like continental plates, slowly, with great force, and with outcomes that were not immediately visible. By 2 in the morning, he had the shape of it. By 4, he had the evidence. Lady Harwick had been careful. She was, Sebastian had always known, an intelligent woman. She had constructed the forgery well. The handwriting was close enough to create plausible doubt. The access log irregularities real enough to raise questions. The timing precise enough to maximize damage. What she had not accounted for was that Sebastian had spent 3 weeks watching Clara work, which meant he had 3 weeks of her actual handwriting in documents he had dictated and she had transcribed. A handwriting analyst, brought in at dawn, at considerable cost and inconvenience to a man who had not expected to need one before breakfast, spent 40 minutes with the documents, and then looked up and said, simply, not the same person. He had the answer by 7 in the morning. He had dismissed Lady Harwick from her position by 7:45, in front of 2 witnesses, and with the particular quietness he reserved for things that did not require volume to be absolute. She had attempted 3 different responses: indignation, explanation, and then, briefly, the suggestion that he was making a decision based on personal feeling rather than evidence, which was the most tactically interesting of the 3. "You are welcome to challenge the documentation through the appropriate channels," Sebastian said, "though I would suggest that a forgery charge carries more social consequences than a dismissal." She left. He dealt with Lord Ashford immediately afterward. That conversation was shorter. Ashford was a man who understood political exposure, and when Sebastian laid out, with complete composure, exactly what had been uncovered and what its implications were for Ashford's own standing in 3 counties, the charm evaporated with the speed of something that had always been purely functional. Ashford departed Greystone Palace before noon, with the expression of a man who was already calculating how to tell this story more favorably elsewhere. Sebastian did not care how Ashford told it. He had already sent 2 letters to council members with the documented evidence and his own assessment of the fabricated financial irregularity from his father's time. He had learned, in 17 years of parliamentary work, that the best defense against political blackmail was aggressive transparency. Remove the secrecy, and the leverage dissolved. He also sent a formal response to the Royal Council's marriage ultimatum. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first outlined his legal standing on the matter. The second documented his parliamentary contributions over the preceding decade with the implication, legible to anyone who read carefully, that making an enemy of him would be more inconvenient than having a duke who married on his own schedule. The third simply said, "The matter is resolved at my discretion. Further correspondence on the subject is unnecessary." He was finished by 2 in the afternoon. He stood for a moment in the quiet of his study, the same room where she had sat across from him night after night, where she had fixed parliamentary language and identified 17-year-old ancestral grievances, with a single conversation with the housekeeper, where she had looked at him across the lamplight and said, "I know what charm designed to extract something looks like," with the certainty of someone who had been extracting the truth from complicated surfaces her entire life. He picked up his coat from the chair where he had abandoned it. He did not send a carriage ahead of him. He did not send a letter, or a footman, or a formal request, or any of the 10 different appropriate and managed ways he had available to him. He rode. November had made the streets gray and sharp-edged, the city holding its breath between seasons, the bare trees lining Calloway Street standing like witnesses. The boarding house was a narrow building with clean windows and a landlady who opened the door and looked at the Duke of Greystone on her front step and said, with admirable composure, "I'll see if she's receiving visitors, sir." "Please," Sebastian said. "Not tell her I'm here or inform Miss Ashby. Please." He waited in the front hallway, not impatiently, not with the restlessness of a man accustomed to immediate compliance, but with the particular quality of stillness that meant something significant was happening to his interior state, and he was allowing it to happen rather than managing it back into order. He heard her on the stairs before he saw her. Then she appeared at the landing and looked down at him, and stopped. She was in a plain dress. No performance, no preparation, no version of herself assembled for external consumption. She looked as she had looked in his study at the end of a long working evening, when the formality had worn off, and she was simply herself, tired and clear-eyed, and more genuinely beautiful than anything he had ever seen constructed with effort. He looked up at her from the hallway. "You rode here yourself," she said. "Yes, in November. The weather was acceptable when I left." She came down the remaining stairs and stopped in front of him. She was searching his face with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, not performing uncertainty, but actually reading him, the way she read parliamentary language for weakness or ancestral disputes for their real subject. He told her everything. Not standing in the hallway, the landlady had, with excellent instincts, made herself scarce, but in the small sitting room off the entrance, where they stood near the window because neither of them sat, and he laid it out with the directness that was the only mode of communication he had ever trusted. Lady Harwick, the forged letter, the access logs and what they actually showed, the handwriting analysis, Ashford's role in the plan and his subsequent departure, the political leverage dismantled, the council's marriage ultimatum and the response he had sent. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The gray November light came through the window and landed on the space between them, which was not very much space. "You dismantled all of it in one morning," she said. "I had the night to prepare. Sebastian," her voice was very quiet. "You didn't have to—" "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the particular grammar of two people who have been extraordinarily careful with each other for a very long time, what came next did not require elaborate construction. "I could not argue with the evidence when I had none," he said. I should have told you in that room that I knew it was fabricated before I had proof, because I know your mind, and I know your character, and I have never once, not for a single moment, believed you were anything other than exactly what you presented yourself to be." He paused. "I was calculating when I should have been speaking. I am sorry." Clara held his gaze steadily through this. She did not deflect it, or diminish it, or offer him easy absolution before he had finished. Then she said, "Thank you." He reached for her face with both hands, carefully, the way he had handled Descartes' first edition, with the reverence one reserved for things of genuine, irreplaceable value. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, and she felt his hands were not entirely steady. The Duke of Greystone, not entirely steady. She put her hands over his. "You rode here," she said again, softer this time. "Through November, without sending a carriage ahead. I find I am increasingly bad at the managed version of things," he said, "where you are concerned." She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was nothing like the careful, composed version of himself that he presented to the world. It was honest and searching and present, and she felt in it everything he had been holding back, not for 3 weeks, not for a month, but for considerably longer. The particular tenderness of someone who had been alone inside very considerable power for a very long time, and had not understood until recently what was missing from the inventory. When they finally drew apart, his forehead rested against hers. Her hands were pressed flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, which was as unsteady as his hands. "Come back," he said, "not to the palace, not to the position. Simply, come back." She looked up at him. "Ask me properly," she said. Something shifted in his expression, warm and almost undone and entirely real. He stepped back. He took her hand. And Sebastian Wyndham, Duke of Greystone, who had faced down royal councils and parliamentary opponents, and 17 years of political warfare without flinching, looked at a woman in a borrowed sitting room in November, and was, for the first time in his adult life, completely afraid. Not of the question, of the answer, and how much it mattered. "Clara," he said, "will you come home?" She smiled, and she said yes. They were married on a morning in December that could not make up its mind between frost and pale sunshine, and finally settled on both. The chapel at Greystone was small by ducal standards. Sebastian's choice over the quiet protest of the estate secretary who had prepared for something considerably larger. Clara had said she wanted only the people she had actually chosen, and Sebastian had looked at her and said exactly that, and written the guest list himself in under 10 minutes. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. He wore the expression of a man who had long since stopped trying to manage his own face. When the vicar pronounced them married, Sebastian did not perform the occasion. He looked at Clara in the cool winter light of the chapel with those iron-gray eyes that had, in the months since November, gradually become something less guarded and more honest. And what was on his face was not composure. It was not the careful control he had spent 34 years perfecting against everything his father had taught him about vulnerability. It was simply the truth. She saw it. She let him see the same. Somewhere in the capital, the Royal Council received a formal notification from the Duke of Greystone. It contained no apology and no request for approval. It announced in 3 sentences that he had resolved the matter of succession at his own discretion, in the manner most consistent with his own judgment, and that further correspondence on the subject remained unnecessary. In a boarding house on Calloway Street, a small room sat empty. In Greystone Palace, a study door stood open, and Clara Ashby, Clara Wyndham, Duchess of Greystone, walked through it and sat at the desk that had always felt, even when it shouldn't have, like hers. Sebastian placed a cup of tea at her elbow. Lemon. No milk. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Some doors are locked by duty, some by fear, and some, if you are very patient and very honest, and willing to walk into the wrong room at exactly the right moment, are locked by a man who simply cannot bear the thought of you walking away. And those are the ones worth staying for. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath during that locked chamber scene, or aching through the separation, or exhaling with relief when he rode through November without sending a carriage ahead, then you already know what this kind of story is really about. It is not just about dukes and palaces and royal intrigue, though there is plenty of that. It is about the particular courage it takes to stay exactly who you are when the world keeps offering you easier, smaller versions of yourself. It is about the fact that the people most worth knowing are often the ones who see you clearly before they say anything about it. And it is about the truth that love, when it is real, does not announce itself with grand speeches. It announces itself with a cup of tea, lemon, no milk, placed at your elbow without being asked. If you have been that person, the one who holds herself together through the past pearls and the turned gloves and the long, quiet years of being overlooked, this story was for you. You are not invisible. The right person will cross the room. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment and tell us which moment stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who loves a royal romance that actually earns its ending. And if you are new here, subscribe, because we tell stories like this one every week, and the next one is already waiting. We will see you in the next chamber.